In the early hours of June 22, 1941, one of the largest and most devastating military operations in human history erupted across the vast eastern frontier of Europe. Stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, nearly 3 million German soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of Axis allies, surged across the Soviet border. This massive offensive, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, marked Adolf Hitler's bold and catastrophic attempt to conquer the Soviet Union. It would become the turning point of World War II and unleash a brutal conflict defined by unprecedented destruction, ideological hatred, and staggering human loss. The invasion shattered the fragile peace between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union and ignited a war of annihilation unlike any the world had ever witnessed. To understand Operation Barbarossa, one must first examine the uneasy alliance that preceded it. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. For Hitler, the pact was a strategic maneuver designed to avoid a two-front war while he conquered Western Europe. For Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, it was an opportunity to buy time and expand Soviet territory. Yet beneath the diplomatic facade, both leaders distrusted each other deeply. Hitler had long viewed the Soviet Union as Germany's ultimate enemy, a vast land he believed was destined to become the Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. He also saw the Soviet regime as the center of what he called Jewish Bolshevism, an ideology he was determined to destroy. By 1940, Germany had achieved stunning victories across Europe. Poland had been crushed in weeks. Denmark and Norway had fallen quickly. France, once considered Europe's strongest military power, collapsed in a matter of months. Britain remained defiant, but Hitler's plans for invasion stalled after failing to secure air superiority during the Battle of Britain. With Western Europe largely under German control, Hitler turned his attention eastward. He became increasingly convinced that conquering the Soviet Union would secure Germany's economic future, eliminate ideological enemies, and force Britain into submission by removing any hope of Soviet support. Preparations for Operation Barbarossa began in secret during late 1940. German military planners designed an operation on a scale never before attempted. The invasion would involve three massive army groups, each assigned a specific objective. Army Group North would advance toward Leningrad, the historic Russian city that symbolized the Bolshevik Revolution. Army Group Center, the largest and most powerful formation, would drive toward Moscow, the Soviet capital and heart of the nation's transportation network. Army Group South would push into Ukraine, a region rich in farmland and industrial resources vital to Germany's war effort. The scale of the invasion was staggering. Over 3,300 German tanks were assembled, supported by nearly 7,000 artillery pieces and more than 2,700 aircraft from the Luftwaffe. Alongside German forces were hundreds of thousands of soldiers from Romania, Hungary, Finland, and other Axis-aligned nations. In total, more than 3.8 million Axis troops stood poised along the Soviet frontier, forming the largest invasion force ever assembled. Despite growing evidence of German military buildup, Stalin refused to believe that Hitler would attack. Soviet intelligence agencies, foreign spies, and even British warnings repeatedly alerted the Kremlin to the impending invasion. However, Stalin dismissed these reports, fearing they were attempts to provoke conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. He believed that Hitler would not risk war on two fronts while Britain remained unconquered. This catastrophic miscalculation left Soviet forces unprepared for the onslaught that was about to begin. At precisely 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, German artillery erupted across the Soviet border. Thousands of guns unleashed a devastating bombardment on Soviet defenses. Moments later, waves of German aircraft roared overhead, targeting airfields, supply depots, and communication centers. Within hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed, many still sitting on the ground. The surprise attack paralyzed Soviet command structures and shattered frontline defenses. German panzer divisions quickly advanced, slicing through Soviet positions and encircling entire armies. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, advanced rapidly through the Baltic states. German forces encountered fierce resistance but continued pushing toward Leningrad. The invasion was accompanied by brutal policies carried out by Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads tasked with eliminating political commissars, Jewish civilians, and other groups considered enemies of the Nazi regime. These units followed closely behind advancing troops, transforming the military campaign into a genocidal operation. Meanwhile, Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, achieved some of the most dramatic successes of the early campaign. German armored spearheads penetrated deep into Soviet territory, capturing thousands of prisoners in massive encirclement battles. The battles of Bialystok and Minsk resulted in the destruction of entire Soviet armies. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed in a matter of weeks. German commanders believed victory was within reach, and morale among German troops soared as they advanced deeper into Soviet territory. To the south, Army Group South faced a more complex and challenging campaign. The vast Ukrainian landscape, combined with stronger Soviet resistance, slowed German progress. However, German forces, supported by Romanian troops, continued to advance, targeting key cities and agricultural regions. Control of Ukraine was essential for Germany's war economy, providing access to grain, coal, and industrial resources. The initial success of Operation Barbarossa stunned the world. Soviet forces appeared to collapse under the weight of the German assault. Entire divisions were destroyed or captured, and German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers within weeks. Yet beneath these early victories, critical challenges were already emerging. German supply lines stretched dangerously thin as troops moved deeper into Soviet territory. Roads were poor, rail networks used different gauges, and vast distances complicated logistics. Fuel, ammunition, and food struggled to keep pace with the rapidly advancing front lines. Despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin, initially shocked and silent, soon addressed the Soviet people in a radio broadcast calling for total resistance. He framed the conflict not merely as a war against Germany, but as a great patriotic war to defend the Soviet homeland. Millions of Soviet citizens responded to the call. Factories were relocated eastward beyond the reach of German bombers. Civilians constructed defensive fortifications. New armies were raised from the immense manpower reserves of the Soviet Union. One of the defining features of Operation Barbarossa was its ideological brutality. Unlike previous German campaigns, this was not simply a military conquest. Nazi leadership viewed the war against the Soviet Union as a racial and ideological struggle. German soldiers were encouraged to view Soviet citizens as inferior and expendable. Orders were issued permitting the execution of political officers and allowing widespread atrocities against civilians. Villages were destroyed, prisoners were starved, and mass executions became common across occupied territories. As summer 1941 progressed, German forces continued their relentless advance. Army Group Center pushed toward Smolensk, capturing the strategic city after intense fighting. The battle temporarily slowed German momentum, but inflicted further massive losses on Soviet forces. German commanders debated their next objective. Some believed they should drive directly toward Moscow, hoping to deliver a decisive blow that would collapse Soviet resistance. Others argued that securing Ukraine and Leningrad was equally important for economic and strategic reasons. Hitler ultimately intervened, ordering panzer divisions to support operations in the north and south, a decision that would later become one of the most controversial strategic choices of the war. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union began adapting to the brutal realities of the conflict. New commanders emerged, learning from early mistakes. Soviet industry, relocated east of the Ural Mountains, began producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at astonishing rates. The T-34 tank, with its sloped armor and powerful gun, soon became one of the most effective weapons on the battlefield. Soviet soldiers, initially overwhelmed, gradually developed defensive tactics designed to slow German advances. By late summer, Operation Barbarossa had already become the largest and bloodiest campaign in human history. Millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in a vast conflict stretching across thousands of kilometers. German forces had achieved extraordinary gains, capturing vast territories and inflicting devastating losses on the Soviet military. Yet the Soviet Union remained defiant, refusing to surrender. The stage was set for a prolonged and brutal war that would consume entire nations and reshape the course of global history. As autumn approached, the German advance continued, but new challenges emerged. The weather began to change, turning roads into rivers of mud that trapped vehicles and slowed movement. Soviet resistance stiffened as fresh troops arrived from Siberia and other regions. German commanders realized that the war they had expected to win in months was far from over. The vastness of the Soviet Union, combined with its enormous population and industrial capacity, posed challenges that German planners had underestimated. Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of a conflict defined by unimaginable suffering. It would lead to the siege of Leningrad, the battle for Moscow, and eventually the catastrophic defeat of German forces at Stalingrad. But in the summer of 1941, those future battles remained uncertain. German troops continued their advance, driven by confidence and ideological zeal, while Soviet forces fought desperately to defend their homeland. The invasion of the Soviet Union transformed World War II into a truly global and total war. It mobilized entire societies, intensified ideological hatred, and unleashed violence on a scale previously unimaginable. Operation Barbarossa would not only determine the fate of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but would ultimately shape the outcome of the entire war. As the front line stretched deeper into Soviet territory, both sides prepared for a struggle that would test the limits of endurance, sacrifice, and survival. As July 1941 unfolded, the sheer speed of the German advance left the Soviet Union struggling to regain control of its shattered defenses. Entire Soviet frontline formations had vanished in encirclement pockets, their soldiers captured in numbers that stunned even seasoned German commanders. Long columns of exhausted Soviet prisoners marched westward under guard, often without food or water, foreshadowing the immense human tragedy that would define the Eastern Front. Yet despite these devastating losses, new Soviet formations continued to appear, drawn from the vast population of the Soviet Union. The Red Army, though battered, was far from defeated. At the center of the German offensive, the Battle of Smolensk emerged as a critical moment in the early invasion. Situated along the main highway to Moscow, Smolensk represented both a strategic gateway and a psychological prize. German panzer divisions advanced rapidly, attempting to repeat the encirclement tactics that had proven so successful in Poland and France. However, Soviet forces resisted with increasing determination. Reinforced by newly mobilized troops, Soviet defenders launched counterattacks that surprised German commanders. Although the Germans eventually captured Smolensk after intense fighting, the battle slowed their advance and exposed growing weaknesses in German planning. Time, which Hitler had hoped to conquer with speed and surprise, was beginning to slip away. While German troops celebrated their victories, they increasingly faced logistical nightmares. The deeper they advanced into Soviet territory, the longer and more vulnerable their supply lines became. German military planners had assumed that Soviet infrastructure could be quickly repurposed for German use. Instead, they encountered destroyed railways, sabotaged bridges, and retreating Soviet forces employing scorched-earth tactics. Crops were burned, factories dismantled, and entire towns evacuated or destroyed to deny resources to the invaders. The vastness of Soviet territory, combined with these deliberate acts of destruction, began to strain German supply systems beyond their limits. Fuel shortages became particularly dangerous for the fast-moving panzer divisions. German tanks, which had spearheaded the invasion with devastating effectiveness, now found themselves waiting for supplies to catch up. Trucks broke down on primitive roads, while horse-drawn wagons, still widely used by the German army, struggled through dust and mud. The logistical problems that would later cripple the German war effort were already beginning to emerge during these early months of the campaign. In the north, Army Group North continued its relentless march toward Leningrad. German forces advanced through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, encountering fierce resistance from Soviet troops determined to defend the historic city. Leningrad held immense symbolic significance as the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution and a major industrial center. Hitler believed capturing the city would deliver a devastating psychological blow to the Soviet Union. As German troops closed in, Finnish forces advanced from the north, seeking to reclaim territories lost during the Winter War of 1939 and 1940. The combined pressure from German and Finnish armies threatened to trap Leningrad in a deadly siege that would soon become one of the longest and most horrific in history. Further south, Army Group South engaged in massive battles across Ukraine, where Soviet forces were determined to protect vital agricultural and industrial regions. The Ukrainian campaign became a brutal contest of attrition. German and Romanian troops clashed with Soviet defenders in fierce battles around cities such as Lvov and Kiev. Soviet commanders launched counterattacks using large armored formations, attempting to halt the German advance. Some of these battles, including the massive tank clashes near Brody and Dubno, involved thousands of armored vehicles and became some of the largest tank engagements ever fought up to that point in the war. Although Soviet forces demonstrated bravery and numerical strength, poor coordination, outdated communication systems, and overwhelming German tactical superiority often resulted in devastating Soviet losses. Amid these massive battles, the ideological nature of the war intensified. German occupation policies quickly revealed the true purpose of the invasion. Special SS units, known as Einsatzgruppen, followed closely behind frontline troops, carrying out systematic mass executions of Jews, political officials, and other groups targeted by Nazi racial ideology. Entire communities were rounded up and executed in forests, ravines, and open fields. These massacres marked the beginning of what would later evolve into the full-scale genocide known as the Holocaust. The war against the Soviet Union was not only a military campaign, but also a campaign of extermination. As news of German atrocities spread, Soviet propaganda began mobilizing resistance among civilians and soldiers alike. The Soviet government called for total war, urging citizens to sabotage German operations and support partisan movements behind enemy lines. Partisan fighters, often composed of local civilians and retreating soldiers, began launching ambushes, destroying supply lines, and gathering intelligence for the Red Army. These irregular warfare tactics would become a persistent and dangerous threat to German occupation forces throughout the war. Despite mounting challenges, German confidence remained high throughout the summer of 1941. Hitler and many of his generals believed the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. German intelligence consistently underestimated Soviet manpower reserves and industrial capacity. Reports reaching Berlin painted a picture of a dying enemy, unable to replace its staggering losses. These optimistic assessments reinforced Hitler's belief that the campaign could still be won before winter, a belief that would prove dangerously misguided. One of the most controversial decisions of the invasion came in August 1941. German Army Group Center, having achieved significant victories, stood within striking distance of Moscow. Many German generals, including Heinz Guderian, argued that a direct assault on the Soviet capital could end the war. However, Hitler disagreed. He believed securing Ukraine's resources and eliminating Soviet forces around Kiev were more important than capturing Moscow. He ordered armored units from Army Group Center to assist operations in the south. While this decision resulted in one of the largest encirclement battles in history, it delayed the advance toward Moscow and gave the Soviet Union valuable time to reinforce its defenses. The Battle of Kiev became a catastrophic defeat for the Soviet Union. German forces executed a massive encirclement maneuver, trapping several Soviet armies. By the time the battle ended, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured. It was one of the greatest military disasters in Soviet history. German commanders celebrated the victory as proof that Operation Barbarossa was succeeding. Yet the time spent securing Kiev further delayed the German push toward Moscow, allowing the Soviets to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the war. Meanwhile, Stalin began implementing drastic measures to maintain discipline within the Red Army. Soldiers who retreated without orders faced execution, while commanders were held personally responsible for failures. The Soviet government introduced Order No. 270, declaring that any soldier who surrendered was a traitor. Families of captured soldiers could face punishment, creating immense pressure on Soviet troops to fight to the death. These harsh measures reflected Stalin's determination to prevent the collapse of Soviet resistance. As summer gave way to autumn, German forces prepared for the next stage of the invasion. Operation Typhoon, the planned assault on Moscow, began in early October 1941. German forces launched a massive offensive designed to encircle and capture the Soviet capital before winter arrived. Initial progress was rapid, with German armies achieving several encirclement victories around Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured once again, and German troops advanced ever closer to Moscow. However, nature itself soon became one of Germany's greatest enemies. The arrival of the autumn rains transformed Russian roads into seas of mud, a phenomenon known as the Rasputitsa. German vehicles became stuck, supply deliveries slowed to a crawl, and soldiers struggled to advance. The once unstoppable German war machine began losing momentum as logistical problems worsened and Soviet resistance stiffened. At the same time, Soviet intelligence successfully determined that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east. This allowed Stalin to transfer elite Siberian divisions, trained for winter warfare, to reinforce Moscow's defenses. These fresh, well-equipped troops would soon play a critical role in defending the Soviet capital. As German troops pushed toward Moscow, they encountered increasingly desperate Soviet resistance. Civilians joined the construction of defensive fortifications around the city, digging trenches and building barricades. Factories in Moscow continued producing weapons even as German artillery could be heard in the distance. Stalin chose to remain in the city, a symbolic gesture intended to inspire confidence among the Soviet population. His decision helped strengthen morale at a time when fear and uncertainty gripped the nation. By late November 1941, German advance units reached the outskirts of Moscow. Some soldiers reported seeing the city's spires through binoculars. Yet exhaustion, supply shortages, and freezing temperatures began taking a heavy toll on German forces. Many soldiers lacked winter clothing, and mechanical equipment struggled to operate in extreme cold. The German army, which had prepared for a short summer campaign, now faced the brutal reality of a prolonged war in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Operation Barbarossa had begun with breathtaking speed and overwhelming success. Within months, German forces had captured vast territories, destroyed large portions of the Soviet military, and threatened the Soviet capital itself. Yet the invasion had also unleashed forces that Germany could not control. The Soviet Union, though devastated, remained determined to fight. Its immense resources, vast population, and willingness to endure unimaginable sacrifice ensured that the conflict would continue far longer than Hitler had ever anticipated. As winter approached, the fate of Operation Barbarossa hung in the balance. German forces stood closer to victory than ever before, yet they were exhausted, overstretched, and unprepared for the challenges ahead. The Soviet Union, though battered, was preparing to strike back. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and decisive struggles of the Second World War. As December 1941 approached, German forces stood battered and exhausted on the frozen approaches to Moscow. The offensive that had begun with lightning speed 6 months earlier had ground to a near halt. German soldiers, many still wearing summer uniforms, now faced temperatures that plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. Weapons jammed, engines froze, and frostbite claimed thousands of casualties without a single shot being fired. Horses collapsed in the snow, supply convoys stalled, and wounded soldiers often froze to death before reaching medical aid. The German High Command had planned for a campaign lasting mere months, not a prolonged struggle against winter and an enemy refusing to surrender. Despite these mounting hardships, Hitler refused to authorize a large-scale retreat. He believed that holding captured territory was essential to maintaining German momentum and morale. German commanders on the front lines, however, increasingly recognized the danger of their situation. Some attempted tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions, only to face furious opposition from Hitler, who issued strict orders forbidding retreat under any circumstances. This rigid command structure would soon prove costly, trapping German units in positions they could not sustain. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet leadership prepared for what many believed would be the final defense of the capital. Stalin ordered the evacuation of government offices and diplomatic missions, yet he himself refused to leave the city. His decision to remain in Moscow was a powerful propaganda symbol, demonstrating determination and resolve. Soviet authorities mobilized every available resource. Civilians, including women, teenagers, and elderly citizens, worked tirelessly to construct defensive belts around the city. Anti-tank trenches stretched for miles, while barricades were erected across roads and railways. The entire city transformed into a fortress preparing for a desperate fight for survival. Unknown to German commanders, Soviet preparations extended far beyond Moscow's defensive lines. Intelligence reports from Soviet spy networks had confirmed that Japan, despite its alliance with Germany, had no intention of invading the Soviet Far East. This revelation allowed Stalin to transfer tens of thousands of highly trained Siberian troops to the Western Front. These soldiers were equipped with winter clothing, skis, and specialized gear designed for combat in freezing conditions. Their arrival would soon shift the balance of power in ways German commanders had not anticipated. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive around Moscow. Fresh Siberian divisions, supported by newly produced tanks and artillery, struck exhausted German positions along the entire front. German forces, weakened by months of continuous combat and crippled by freezing temperatures, struggled to hold their ground. Soviet troops launched wave after wave of attacks, pushing German forces backward for the first time since the invasion began. The counteroffensive shocked the German High Command. Hitler and his generals had believed the Red Army was on the verge of collapse. Instead, they now faced a revitalized enemy capable of launching coordinated, large-scale operations. German units were forced into desperate defensive battles, often retreating under relentless Soviet pressure. Entire divisions were at risk of encirclement as Soviet forces exploited gaps in German lines. For the Soviet Union, the successful defense of Moscow carried enormous symbolic and strategic significance. The survival of the capital proved that Germany's seemingly unstoppable war machine could be halted. Soviet morale surged as news spread that German forces were being pushed back. The victory at Moscow also strengthened Soviet alliances, encouraging increased military aid from Britain and following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor from the United States as well. The global balance of the war was beginning to shift. Operation Barbarossa, which Hitler had envisioned as a swift and decisive campaign, had failed to achieve its primary objective. The Soviet Union remained in the war, its industrial base relocated and expanding, its armies rebuilding, and its population mobilized for total resistance. German forces had captured vast territories, but they now faced the reality of occupying enormous regions filled with hostile populations and persistent partisan warfare. Behind German front lines, Soviet partisan fighters intensified their operations. They sabotaged railways, destroyed supply convoys, assassinated German officials, and disrupted communications. German occupation forces responded with brutal reprisals, executing civilians and destroying entire villages suspected of supporting resistance fighters. These actions further fueled hatred and strengthened the determination of Soviet civilians to resist German rule. The war in the East was becoming a cycle of violence that consumed soldiers and civilians alike. The human cost of Operation Barbarossa during its first 6 months was staggering. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Entire regions of the Soviet Union lay in ruins. Yet German losses, though smaller in comparison, were far higher than anticipated. German divisions that had begun the campaign at full strength were now severely depleted. Tanks and aircraft had been lost in large numbers, and replacements struggled to reach the front. The German army, once celebrated for its speed and efficiency, was now locked in a brutal war of attrition across one of the largest battlefields in history. The ideological nature of the conflict continued to intensify the brutality on both sides. German policies of racial extermination and occupation, terror convinced many Soviet citizens that surrender meant death or enslavement. This realization strengthened Soviet resistance and transformed the war into a struggle for national survival. Soviet propaganda emphasized the defense of the motherland, portraying the conflict as a patriotic duty that transcended political ideology. Even those who had once opposed Stalin's regime found themselves fighting against a common enemy. By early 1942, the front lines stabilized as winter reached its peak. German forces managed to avoid complete collapse, but they had lost the initiative that had defined the early months of the invasion. The dream of conquering the Soviet Union in a single campaign had evaporated. Instead, Germany now faced a prolonged war against an enemy with vast manpower, immense industrial potential, and a growing network of international allies. For Hitler, the failure to capture Moscow marked a turning point in his war strategy. He remained convinced that victory in the East was still possible, but he began shifting focus towards southern objectives, including the oil-rich regions of the Caucasus. These decisions would lead to new campaigns and even greater battles, including the catastrophic struggle at Stalingrad. Yet the seeds of Germany's eventual defeat had already been planted during the failed invasion of 1941. Operation Barbarossa fundamentally reshaped World War II. It transformed the conflict from a series of rapid German conquests into a global war of endurance. The Eastern Front would become the largest and bloodiest theater of the war, consuming the majority of Germany's military resources and resulting in unimaginable casualties. The invasion also exposed the dangers of ideological warfare, where racial hatred and political extremism fueled acts of violence that shocked the world. The story of Operation Barbarossa is not only one of military strategy and battlefield victories. It is also a story of human endurance, suffering, and survival. Soldiers on both sides faced unimaginable conditions, fighting in extreme weather across vast landscapes while witnessing destruction on a scale rarely seen in human history. Civilians endured occupation, starvation, forced labor, and mass execution, becoming victims of a war that blurred the line between military conflict and genocide. As the first phase of the invasion came to an end, both Germany and the Soviet Union prepared for a conflict that would continue for years. German forces remained deeply entrenched in Soviet territory, determined to regain momentum and achieve the victory that had slipped through their grasp. The Soviet Union, though devastated, had proven its resilience and willingness to sacrifice everything for survival. The invasion of 1941 would be remembered as one of the most ambitious and catastrophic military operations ever attempted. It demonstrated the destructive power of modern warfare and revealed the consequences of ideological extremism when combined with military aggression. Operation Barbarossa set the stage for some of the most decisive battles of World War II, battles that would ultimately determine the fate of Europe and shape the world for generations to come. Yet as winter tightened its grip on the Eastern Front, neither side could fully comprehend the scale of the struggle that still lay ahead. The war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had only just begun, and its outcome remained uncertain. The frozen battlefield surrounding Moscow marked the end of Germany's rapid invasion, but they also signaled the beginning of a brutal, prolonged conflict that would test the limits of human endurance and change the course of history forever.